Chapter 3 of The Car. He went to the instructions again, starting with page 1, picture 1, working against what had already been done, double-checking what the original owner had completed. He didn't know the man's name at first, but a few minutes after he started, a piece of paper fell out of the instruction book with the name Tom Haskell written on it, and he thought of the owner as Tom after that. Whatever the name was, Terry admired his work. The things that were done right. Bolts on the motor mount were torqued to the correct foot-pounds of torque. Everything was aligned properly, squared, and checked. But when Terry was working on the radiator, checking to see if all the hoses were there, the lack of sleep caught up with him. He closed his eyes to blink. Nothing more, and they just didn't open again. He slept sitting on the frame, his forehead against the radiator, which was braced across his knees, for nearly 2 hours. When he awakened, his legs were asleep because the radiator had cut off the circulation, and he stood carefully, went back into the house, walking like Frankenstein, and drank the last of the milk. It was 8 in the morning. He'd worked all night, except for the 2 hours sleep. His brain was still numb, and he went to the couch, flicked the remote to turn the television on, and fell asleep in the middle of a game show. The ringing phone awakened him, and he was sitting up, grabbing for the receiver on the end table before he was fully awake. Hello? Mr. Anders? Yeah. Your phone bill is 2.5 months past due. Mr. Anders, could we expect some payment on it this week? Well, see, the truth is, Terry didn't know what to say. The thing is, Mr. Anders, if you don't pay on it, I'm afraid we'll have to cut service. Terry was fully awake now and realized what had happened. His mother and father had let bills go before they left. He lowered his voice, tried to sound older. I understand. All we can give you is another 2 weeks. Fine. Then will you send money? I'll do what I can. Thank you, Mr. Anders. Terry hung up and stood. Between sitting and standing, the whole conversation on the phone left his mind. The car. He had to work on the car. He went to the kitchen and ate some lunch meat. There was some mustard in a jar, and he smeared it on the meat before chewing it. And while still chewing, he made his way to the garage where the car waited. He was at the point where the body had to be right to give him places to bolt new things, like putting the radiator in place. It needed side mounts to hold it, and without the engine compartments, there would be no side mounts. He started with the compartment itself, bolting the red side panels onto the frame, squirting thread lock on each nut to make sure they wouldn't vibrate loose later, even though he was also using lock washers. With the compartment in place, the pieces started to look like a car, and he stepped back to study it. He smiled. Not much of a car, but there was a shape coming, a look to it. The side compartments on the engine where the sweeping fenders would bolt on gave the kit the beginning look of a car. Started to show some of the curves. He finished bolting the radiator in place, adjusting it to clear the blades of the fan mounted on the front end of the engine. The hoses from the radiator to the engine and back took some work, but Tom had ordered them right. And by twisting and turning and wrapping them, Terry finally got them into position and clamped on tightly. Steering was next. Tie rods and steering gear were already placed on the frame, but there was no wheel or shaft coming through the firewall to steer the car with. He found the shaft and turn indicator bracket, but there was no wheel. And the whole assembly was obviously from another car, as were the engine and wheels. For a moment, it threw him until he found the title of ownership in a plastic bag taped in place in the back of the instruction manual. All the parts not from the kit: the four-cylinder engine, the wheels and tires, the steering column, and the brakes were from a 1974 Ford Pinto. The title and papers from the original car were in the plastic bag along with a note from a mechanic. "Tom," Terry read aloud, "I've gone completely over the engine and rebuilt it to tighter tolerances than they have in the factory. It will be better than new. Just break it in slow, real slow, and let the rings seat on their own without pushing it." And in a last box, leaning against the inside of the frame and hidden from view, Terry found the steering wheel. "It's beautiful," he spoke aloud when he opened the box. The wheel was black leather, polished and hand-rubbed with brushed stainless steel spokes. In the middle was a horn ring with the Bearcat emblem in the center. There were also complete instructions on how to mount the steering wheel, and he put it in just because it looked good. Even though the dash wasn't quite complete yet, and all the instruments weren't all hooked up. Excuse me. When the wheel was in and lined up right and tightened down, he stepped back and looked at the overall car again. Having the wheel in place gave it an even more complete look, and he smiled, almost laughed. He was going to have a car. It was right there. All the rest of what he needed was right there in front of him. The parts just needed to be bolted together. But right now he was hungry, worse, starved, and there was nothing in the house. He took $10 from his stash and rode his bicycle to the supermarket 9 blocks away. And all the way, with every push and pull of his foot on the pedal of the bike, he thought, "Next time I go to the store, I'll take the cat." End of chapter 3.